On episode 405 of the Mattie James podcast, we are talking about 4 mistakes that influencers always make whenever they pitch brands. We're going to talk about those 4 things because guess what? I get questions about it all the time. I get questions in my DMs, in my emails. You know, when we were still seeing people in person, you know, over at workshops and conferences, people would ask me about these things all the time. And it was so important to me to dedicate an entire episode to these 4 mistakes. So let's get into it. So for the last almost 6 years, I have been a full-time influencer. And so interacting with brands, pitching brands to execute paid projects is a big part of my job. It's really, really huge. It's something that we're doing on a weekly basis. We do it many, many times throughout the month. And it is definitely a little bit intimidating, right? Especially when you come across a household name brand that you've wanted to work with for a while. But here's what I want to encourage you with. You not only are lucky to be working with the brand, but the brand is lucky to be working with you. So there are things that you don't want to do if you in fact want to be taken seriously. You want to make sure that you're getting the utmost value out of the brand deal and not just the brand getting value. And you also want to make sure that you're putting yourself in a situation where there will be future partnerships, maybe with the same brand or just more brands to come. So the first thing you don't want to do is not negotiate, right? This is what people do all the time. You're saying no instead of negotiating. So prime example of this is if you and a brand start, corresponding. Let's say you reached out to the brand. They love your idea. You guys had a really brief, phone call or even video call. They want to work together and they say, hey, our budget is $2,000, but you really wanted $3,500. One of the biggest mistakes that influencers make is that they're like, okay, well, they only have $2,000, so I'm going to go ahead and say no. Or the other mistake that they make is, okay, well, they only have $2,000, so I have to do it. Just because a brand says they only have X amount of dollars doesn't mean you aren't able to negotiate it accordingly, right, to what you want. It's very, very important for you to go in with a number in mind that you would like. Are you always going to get this number? No, but it's really important for you to pitch in a way where you get close to this number. And what I want you to get used to and get familiar with is that negotiating is just part of pitching. There is very, very seldom, if ever, going to be a time where a brand is just going to be like, here's the number we have. And, you're going to be like, okay, that's just what it is, right? It's really important to negotiate. And it's really important to negotiate in a way that not only benefits you and the rate you want, but benefits the brand in a way where they still feel like they're getting the utmost value. So you don't want to be afraid to negotiate not only the dollar amount, but even whatever the details and the deliverables are within the scope of work. Another mistake that influencers always make when they pitch brands is that they're saying yes before they even know the entire scope of work. I know this from experience. It is always the worst, right? You're excited because the brand said a number. You're like, you know what? This is actually close to, if not the number I wanted. Let's go ahead and get started, right? You maybe get the contract or the agreement. You sign because you're so excited. You didn't read the agreement. You didn't read the details and the specifics of the contract, only to find out later on that you're doing much more work than you originally agreed to, whether it was in a phone call, email correspondence, and all of that. So it is super important. Even to the point of being slightly annoying, to get crystal clear on everything that the brand expects you to do before you go ahead and sign the agreement to execute the deliverables and scope of work of a brand partnership. Trust me, you do not want to do this. One, just because it's important to be clear on what you're doing when it comes to a brand partnership. But the other thing that's really important is to make sure that you don't have any resentment or even any regrets with doing this brand partnership. Yes, it is hard work. It does require you to show up and put forth a really great effort, but you don't want to resent doing this. And so one of the best ways to make sure there's no resentment, there's no ill feelings at the end of a partnership, even if it was hard, is being very clear on the work that you're expected to do in this partnership before you say yes. The third mistake that influencers always seem to make when they are pitching brands, again, I'm speaking from experience, so I know firsthand, is you're not getting a countersigned agreement. We just got done talking about agreements. Guys, when it comes to contracts, agreements, which are the same thing, it's just depending on what term you want to use. But when it comes to that legal document that is signed, not only are you supposed to be signing the document, but it's your responsibility to make sure that the brand or the agency that's representing the brand is signing the contract as well, and you have it on file and on hand for whatever reason, right? Things happen all the time, right? Partnerships dissolve, and sometimes it's not even bad. It's amicable. But you want to make sure that legally you guys are both covered. You guys are both in a really great position legally to walk away from this partnership if it's no longer a match. And the only way you'll be able to do this full throttle is if when you guys are signing the agreement, you are getting a Countersigned agreement. And let me also encourage you with one thing. I do not care how well-known this brand is, I do not start one step of work until I receive that Countersigned agreement, So whether it takes them, 3 hours or 3 days, sometimes it's taken 3 weeks, but it is so important to me to make sure that if I took the time out to sign an agreement for a brand to make sure that we can fulfill whatever duties necessary for this partnership, that they do the same for me. So do not be afraid to enforce that and say, hey, thanks so much for sending this over. It's signed. Please make sure you send the countersigned copy as soon as possible. The last mistake that influencers tend to make whenever they pitch brands is that instead of pitching a specific idea, you're looking for an opportunity. And guys, it's 2021. Brands working with influencers is no longer an anomaly. It's no longer this pie in the sky goal, This is something that brands expect to do. They have the budgets allotted. They have teams dedicated to it. And so when you reach out to a brand, you definitely want to make sure you're pitching a specific idea, a relevant idea, a valuable idea. I can't encourage this enough. So many times I've heard, a follower of mine or somebody from my Boss Fluence community say to me, hey, I reached out to this brand, but nobody said anything at all. And so I'll say, hey, send over what you sent. I'm happy to audit it for you. It's like, just skim over it and look at it for you. And what will happen is that the email is super, super generic. There is no specific ask. There is no clear value or even relevance to the brand. And so you want to make sure that you have all of these things in mind whenever you send a pitch over to a brand. It's really, really important. Not only does this show that you are attentive and present to what you're doing when it comes to pitching, but then it also shows that you've done your research. It also shares that you understand what the brand values and you understand why you're valuable and why you even took the step to even take the chance to be in their inbox and pitch a potential opportunity. So do not be generic. You want to be specific, relevant, and valuable whenever you pitch a brand. All right, you guys, that does it for this episode of the Mattie James podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I always love hearing your feedback. Be sure to send me a quick message over on Instagram at the Mattie James and let me know what you thought about the show. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you have an extra 60 seconds, please give this podcast a rating and review over on iTunes. Pitching can be intimidating, but you want to just take your time and be present with it. Take the time out to just kind of look back at your previous pitches, practice pitching, and go ahead and just take that step. Sometimes it is easier said than done, but trust me, when you take that first step, I promise you won't regret it. You'll only get better the more you go along. I'll talk to you guys next time on the next episode of the Mattie James podcast.